We have been interested in the role of business in society from day one. We were established in the mid-1980s by Hitachi Limited and a group of very prominent Americans who saw this as an opportunity at the early days of globalization to think about how a company, through a very unusual structure for a foundation, can learn about the expectations in other countries of good companies. So as Hitachi was expanding its role in the US market, they wanted to know more about what Americans expected of businesses. So in part, we were established to help them understand that. And in the process of asking the question, what is a good business and what are the expectations of Americans, we developed a deeper agenda around good business practice. As a foundation, as an organization that's concerned about major challenges in American society, we've been very concerned about the income gap, about poverty. And so we asked, well, what do good businesses do to create opportunities for people to have good quality jobs and with pathways of upward mobility? And what is the role that business plays in potentially ameliorating poverty in the process? So that's why we do it. We do it from a couple of different angles. One, we look at traditional businesses in sectors. We take a sector-based approach. And we try to understand within those sectors, where are the employers that are creating good quality jobs? And why do they do it? And what is it that they're doing? And what are the results that they're getting as, from their effort? And we've looked at manufacturing, we've looked at healthcare, and we found a lot, actually, much more than we expected. And it was easier to find them than we thought, because we tended, before we embraced this approach, we tended to think that there were just a handful. They constantly get mentioned. They're held up as the idiosyncratic exceptions to the rule. So when we began to work through trade associations and organizations that actually have knowledge of business and discovered that there were quite a few out there, we were pleased to be able to have a broader base from which to discover what's going on. The second part is looking at the next generation of business leaders, and in that role we focus on young entrepreneurs that are creating market-based businesses where the solution, where the innovation of the business is to try to ameliorate poverty in some way. So we're trying to provide an incentive and some evidence that the innovative spirit of business can be dedicated to creating solutions to social problems, not just solutions to other problems. And that's been very rewarding. And the third part of it is our relationship with business schools, because we think that's a critically important place where the next generation of leaders are minted. And we would like to have some influence in the way in which business school education is administered. You know, it's very hard to generalize. There are lots of obstacles and some of them are sector specific, some of them are place specific, some of them are individual. But there's a lot of myth about the trade-off between investing in people and profits. And then there are some that are beginning to bring so much more texture and knowledge to that equation and recognize that maybe there isn't a trade-off. But the prevailing view is that there is, and so one of the challenges is to break that view. And how do you do that? You know, there's lots of literature on diffusion and the challenges of diffusion, but we've discovered that it's not automatic, that because you hold up one employer as having found the way to do this, that several others will follow. So the challenge of changing the prevailing view that this is a trade-off that they can't endure is a big one. And so we're trying to figure out how to begin to shift the perception of that trade-off. So that's one thing, it's just perception of trade-off. And in some cases, there is some trade-off in terms of the time frame for productivity that goes against the expectations of financiers, of people who are investing in these businesses. So one is that there isn't necessarily a trade-off, but it could be that the time frame for profitability may be extended, and that may not be acceptable to those who are investing in those businesses. So there's that challenge. There's also the knowledge of how to organize and manage these workplaces. It's not something that is actually taught in schools that are preparing people to be business leaders. There's very little in the curricula of business schools across the board that helps people to be great leaders of people. And I don't understand why that is, because that's one of the core competencies, it seems to me, of great businesses. Well, I think this was a challenging conference to put together, because what we chose to do was to bring individuals together who represent different institutions that don't typically come together. And throughout the day, the word we should do this, we should do that, keeps coming up, but we're not really a collective body. This is the first time that many of these people have come together. So I guess my hope, which is not a grand expectation or hope, it's much more modest, and that is for each to think about our own span of authority and to think about the interesting ideas that came up through this dialogue and see what we can do. So for me, I have a role as a president of a foundation and with my peers in philanthropy, and there's some interesting ideas that we'll talk about as a group of foundations and see how they might move forward. There are some interesting ideas that could be embraced by labor, others that could be embraced by business leaders. So at a minimum, I hope that people will take these ideas, think about their own span of influence, and see how they can work with them and massage them and move them to the next level. Beyond that, I hope that maybe we can find some good alliances that may not have otherwise happened, where people can work together to take something to another level. But the challenge with events like this, it's a one-day event. These are people that barely know one another, and we'll all go off in our other back to where we live. And it could be, a lot of it could be lost. I hope that doesn't happen, but I don't have an expectation of a grand scheme coming out of this. But I did take a quick glance around the room to see the ideas that were emerging, and there were some really good ones.